Well, good morning, folks. I'm hoping you can all hear me, or good day, or good night, since I think people are signing on from around the globe, which is a wonderful thing. I'm Steve Heilig, a host at Commonweal New School. And this beautiful morning in the San Francisco Bay Area, where both Frank and I are, we're very glad to be here and that you have been able to join us. The historical background of this particular talk is that beginning of the year, January, February, Frank and I decided it would be nice to do another talk. We did one 3 years ago when his book, The 5 Invitations, came out. We did it in person at Commonweal, as we like to do, and did a recording and had that posted, and approximately 12,000 people have watched that video on YouTube. So obviously there was a great interest in hearing Frank talk about things. So we scheduled this to have an in-person talk. And then, of course, right about that time, we started to hear about a new virus coming to the United States, spreading around the world. And we postponed it because we did not want at that point to do a virtual talk. We love to do them in person, but we thought maybe we'll see what's going to happen. So the rest is history, as you know. We are in the midst of this great pandemic. And it's been a very challenging and even harrowing time for many people around the planet at this point, which makes it even more relevant that the title of this talk, as we had scheduled it and we kept it for this time, was This Vulnerable Human Life. What has happened both in our own lives and in the lives of many around the planet, of course, is that we're experiencing great threats to our health, livelihood, psychic and emotional well-being, etc. I can tell you just personally, I've had some, since we postponed this talk, I've had both some health challenges, nothing life-threatening yet, but and a fair amount of grief. And since we did the talk 3 years ago, Frank, our speaker, has had some very serious challenges as well. So I think everybody who's on here probably knows who Frank Ostaseski is, but just in the briefest sense, he was the co-founder of the Zen Hospice Project here in San Francisco, where many people both experience the end of their own lives and many experience training in how to help with that and how to experience it themselves, including myself, an invaluable training experience that we had. He since went on to found the Metta Institute, which has done a lot of training of providers and clinicians and people who help other people, and has been a speaker around the world, including virtually here, but also physically around the world. So what I'd like to do is invite Frank to welcome us as well, and to say what he wishes about the topic of the day and anything else he wishes. And then we will have some dialogue, and then we will be opening it up on the chat function at a minimum, where you'll be able to ask questions of us as well. So again, welcome everybody else, and welcome to you, Frank, my dear friend and teacher. And please welcome everybody on and say whatever you wish.
Well, it's sweet to be with you, Steve. And I don't know about teacher, but I think of us as longtime spiritual friends. That's what I think of us as. And I'm very grateful for that friendship. You've taught me a lot over the years, and I've learned immensely from you. And I'm happy to be here. You know, I love Commonweal and the New School, and, you know, have a great admiration for their work around the world. And I'm glad we can have a chance to talk. And I'm hoping we get lots of opportunities to talk with the folks that are on the call. And yeah, our subject today is vulnerability, you know, and it's not one we like to even imagine, actually. You know, I come from a Buddhist tradition, right? So that's my reference point, at least to begin here. And you know, Steve, at the entrance to every zendo, every meditation hall, there's a large wooden block. It's called a han. And it's a hard oak block. And it's hit with a wooden mallet to call people into the zendo when it's time to come for meditation. And across on that block is written in black Sumi ink a teaching, a message, if you will. And it's translated in lots of different ways, but the one I like best is, life and death are of supreme importance. Life passes swiftly, and opportunity is lost. Awaken, awaken. Do not squander this life. Yeah? And every day, teachers and students pass by this block and read the teaching, of course. But what I find most fascinating is that over the years, all that hammering of the wooden mallet on the block, it literally drives the words into the block itself. And the block becomes the teaching. You know, the words can't be read anymore, but the block itself becomes the teaching. And it too becomes a fragile and vulnerable thing. And eventually, like the rest of us, it falls apart too. Yeah. I think that what happens for us as human beings is that when we relax our clinging to our treasured beliefs and our fixed ideas and our self-images, we become a more vulnerable thing. And you know, of course, we have a lot of resistance to the blows of life, you know, but if we stop trying to manage uncertainty so much and we can hold ourselves a little more lightly. And we, maybe like the block, become less of a solid thing. So vulnerability, normally we think of it as the susceptibility to being harmed, that we can be hurt physically or emotionally, psychologically in some way. That's the general understanding of it. But I have a different appreciation of it, or a different understanding of it. I think of vulnerability as a kind of porousness that allows the world, all the beauty and horror of this world, to impress itself on our souls, on our consciousness, on our bones, so to speak. And that's part of what allows us to appreciate the world, but also to build a kind of empathetic bridge to the people that we know in our life. Yeah. And ultimately, what happens is that vulnerability, well, again, mostly what we think about it is our defense against harm. But that isn't vulnerability. What vulnerability is this pure openness, you know, this non-defensiveness, actually, that allows us to be much more receptive, that allows reality to influence us and act on us. So our attempts to stay invulnerable, like some kind of teenager, you know, yes, it's a kind of shell that we build around ourselves that tries to keep the pain out, but also it keeps out what we need most, each other's tenderness and love. And you know, if we harden to the world like that, yeah, we keep out the pain, but we also keep out the qualities that we most need to be fully human. And so I've learned to make friends with vulnerability. You know, I think of it as the most exquisite of human qualities, because, you know, it allows us to really know things. And I'll finish up here, but, you know, the one thing I can remember from high school biology, and I don't remember much at all, was the teaching of osmosis, how things permeate, you know, cross semi-permeable membranes, yeah? And influence each cell influences each other. And for me, it's a bit like that, you know? Vulnerability reminds me and that we are all sensitive souls that can be easily influenced, you know? And that not just by the pains and pleasures of our bodies, but by the emotional upheavals of our own hearts and the dramas of our mind. So vulnerability gives us the possibility of experiencing, of being aware, of being in contact with all levels of reality. So in my mind, vulnerability is closer to permeability, closer to non-defensiveness. Yeah. So I wanted to just start there. It was a way of reframing this idea of vulnerability so that we don't just think of it as something we have to avoid or somehow manage in our life. Yeah. So I don't want to yak on too long. I want to be in conversation with you and the people on the call if possible. So I'll stop there and we'll see what's on your heart and mind, Steve.
Well, thank you for that beautiful opening. And you've started with the personal level appropriately so. So again, I rewatched our talk from 3 years ago, right? About exactly 3 years ago, and talked to Farah a bit about how this was actually hard-won wisdom. And I mean, one of the things you said then, I used to think I knew a lot about dying. Then I had my own heart attack. And so you talked about that, and subsequent to that talk, you had a stroke. So I think that this is not an academic or abstract words and feeling for you about how vulnerable you have really been, and that eventually we all are in some way or another, but you have lived through it. So I'm wondering, since 3 years ago when you had the heart attack and come through that with great struggle, what more what more learning has been forced upon you?
Yeah, well,
that you might want to share with us.
Well, thank you. And I maybe I'm just really dull, and thick-headed, and so reality keeps trying to act on me to help me understand more. Yeah, it's true. I don't know now, maybe a year ago, I woke one morning with severe headache, and I didn't know what it was. I probably should have, given the work I do, but I didn't know. And I was in incredible pain. And my wife could understand, and she called, the emergency people, and they said, get him to the hospital right away. And I was having a stroke. And what's true about the heart attacks and also the strokes is that, well, what I say is that I've been with a lot of people who are dying, who are, that I've sat next to bedside. But the view from the other side of the sheets is really different. When you're the person in the bed, it's a really different kind of understanding that emerges for us. And, I wish I could say that I was, that I did it all perfectly. I failed miserably, I wasn't always able to maintain some kind of balance and insight in my experience. It was scary, and I resisted the experience. Curiously, not initially, Steve. What was really interesting to me anyway, I don't know if it's interesting to the viewers, but, when the stroke actually happened, while there was a severe pain, there was a kind of background awareness, I'll call it. I don't know what else to call it, which was able to watch my brain go offline. I mean, what was happening in my brain was that I couldn't tell the difference between night and day anymore. And I had no sense of direction. I couldn't find my way from the bed to the bathroom. It was really, my brain was really confused, but awareness wasn't confused. Awareness was able to observe and watch that experience occurring. And so what happened after the initial anxiety and fear is that the locus of my attention rested in the awareness. And then there wasn't so much fear. Then there wasn't so much anxiety. So I'm grateful for that. And it's been a great asset for me, a great help for me. I don't know. Ask me another question.
Well, I'm wondering about that. I'm actually reminded of our mutual friend. You were much closer to him, Ram Dass,
Yeah.
who since our last talk also passed on, and you spent a lot of time with him. When he had his stroke over 20 years ago, I talked to him not long after, really, and I asked him, you're a great teacher of meditation and spirituality, and did that training, seasoning help you in this experience? So I'm wondering, what you're talking about, the distancing, the observing that you could do that helped you. Was that, you relate that to being a meditator, to Buddhist teaching and training, or?
Yes, and I think of it as certainly a fruit, if you will, of my training. Was it Bruce Lee that said, in times of distress, we don't rise to our best expectation, we fall to our training. And so, yes, it was in part my training, but also it was a kind of basic trust that I have in my life about who we actually are and what the nature of our nature is, in a way. That was helpful, I think. And also, honestly, it got kind of kickstarted by the stroke, because I learned later that where the stroke occurred in my brain, the occipital lobe, is generally responsible for things like space and time. And what it did was catapult me out of space and time. And I was in a kind of non-conceptual awareness for a period of time. And that was actually helpful to not feeling so much anxiety and fear. So, yeah, there are lots of things about it that was so, but, I had 5 strokes, Steve, not just one. And so I was in and out of the hospital every couple of weeks. And I don't like hospitals, and they scare me, honestly. And but every once in a while, you find this gem in them, like it was a harsh environment to be in the hospital, frankly. But I remember one night there was this young lab tech who woke me up, at 3 a.m. to take my blood so that they could have it in the morning for the docs, results for the docs. And this young 29-year-old woman, Julia was her name, I remember her still. And she came in and she said, "I'm so sorry to wake you, sir." She was very polite. And she said, "But I have to take your blood, for the lab." And I said, "It's okay, you can do it. But first you have to tell me something that you love." And she looked at me like, "Who is this crazy old guy?" And she said, "Well, I love my son." I said, "Oh, tell me about him." And she told me that he was 5 years old, and she loved him beyond words. And I said, "Oh, I love my granddaughter like that. She's 5 too. We should get them together, And then we met in this other place. We met in a human place, a vulnerable human place, actually. And we had this kind of exchange. And at the end, she said, "Boy, I sure liked being with you." And I said, "Well, please bring this to the next room, to the next person you go and see, And I trust that she did. And it was beautiful to be with her and to be so human. And I thanked her for doing it so well, that not only did she, prick me with a needle skillfully, but she did it humanly, kindly. We met heart to heart, human to human. When I left that hospital, I have to tell you that I got in the car, my wife was going to drive me home, and I started crying. And she said, "Honey, what is it?" And I said, "I don't want to leave Julia." I was okay leaving some of the docs, but I didn't want to leave Julia, because I felt like I got exactly what I needed from her, which is just to meet each other, human to human. And when we know our own vulnerability, well, then we can meet others in that same place. And I think it's the thing that contributes most to healing, actually.
Have you been in touch? Have you been in touch with her since?
No,
Mm-hmm.
no, I don't know how to reach her. I mean, I suppose I could get her through the hospital, but I know what we had is real, and we don't have to have another encounter, But wow, it's interesting to see who's going to contribute most to your healing. And for me, it was Julia. Yeah.
Well, and this has been, I have to say, with Metta Institute, that you and Rachel Remen and others has been a part of the teaching, is trying to teach people who are caregivers to make that connection. So,
yeah, my wife and I were up at a friend's house in Petaluma after the first 2 strokes, and I thought I could have a swim in their pool, and that because I like to be in the water. And when I got out and I was getting dressed, suddenly my left side got very weak, and I realized I was having a stroke, and my ability to speak went away, and I had this garbled speech, and my face drooped, and oh boy. And we were close to the hospital, so my wife drove me to the emergency room there, and we were in the ER, and there was this nurse, Stephen. It was a guy, and he was so great. He was so kind. And I said to him, how'd you get so kind? ER staff is, they move fast. They're often cowboys, and he said, I had a mentor. And he said this mentor showed us how to be comfortable with people when there was nothing to do, how to listen deeply to people. His mentor was also a hospice doc, as well as being an ER doc. And he told me about how the model that this doctor provided and the little bit of guidance he offered had really changed the way that he practiced. He did his clinical practice in the ER. And I turned to my wife, Vanda, and I said, I think he's talking about Steve. Steve was a student of mine at the Metta Institute. You know him. I won't out him here, but he's a really great doc. And so Vanda turned to this young nurse, and she said, well, you're caring for your mentor's mentor now. And this ER nurse, he just started to cry right there in the ER, and he was very real, and I felt safe in his hands. I felt really safe in his hands. Our expertise are important. I was glad that ER nurse knew what the hell he was doing. I was glad that Julia could stick me with a needle in a skillful way. I want people who have mastery, who have good expertise. I have a lot of tools that I've developed over the years, but I don't lead with my tools. I lead with my humanity. And then, when I need a tool, I can reach there and get it. But the most important thing is to connect human to human. And to the people who are on this call, many of whom I'm sure are caregivers and some are clinicians, that's the message I most want to convey. That it is your own vulnerability, your own human heart that, may be your greatest asset. Yeah.
So there's a striking example of the ripple effect of your teaching, Metta Institute's teaching, kind of rippling out and then coming back right to your own bedside. I mean, what do you call that? Karma? This is like it's a wonderful thing.
Synchronicity, at least, yes.
Synchronicity, maybe both. Yeah. I wonder if you want to say anything more about Ram Dass. I know you were close to him. And he was a teacher to so many, and including in this realm of mortality and such.
Well, yes, he was, and very dear friend, and when I had my strokes, he called me in the hospital, and he said, "So what'd you see? Did you see any tunnels of light, any bardos?" And I said, "No, nothing." He said, "Same thing happened for me when he had his strokes." He said, "All I saw was the pipes in the ceiling as they were rolling me into the ER." So we talked about how we'd both been miserable failures, that we didn't transcend anything, really. But we also talked about our humanity. And, one of the things that I most loved about Ram Dass was how he often taught from his mistakes. That's where he was wisest and most compassionate, is speaking from his mistakes. I remember being with him once. We were teaching at Metta Institute together, and I said, Ram Dass, in that moment when you had your strokes and everybody wanted you to be Ram Dass, what did you really want? And very kindly he said, I wanted somebody like you to be with me. Somebody who didn't need me to be someone special, who didn't need me to be the awakened one, And that was a really good lesson for me to hear that from him. We were like two old Jews in Miami talking on the phone about our strokes and the various, conditions that arose, the symptoms that we had. But, mostly we just were grateful to be alive. And what I saw from Ram Dass is that for years and years and years, he talked about the importance of love and loving awareness. And as he came closer to the end of his life, I spoke with him often as he came close to the end of his life. He just became love, Steve. He just was love. And that maybe sounds conceptual, but he looked through the eyes of love at everything. And so nothing was outside of that love, and I think that's what he transmitted to me, and also what I'm discovering as being most important. Love is not a gated community. Everything gets in, all the parts of ourselves that feel unlovable or that we want to, distance ourselves from, and everybody else, they're allowed. Everything's allowed in the territory of love. And it's not wishy-washy and California woo-woo. It's not like it's, this love is stable and steady and strong. And it enables us to meet what seems impossible. Yeah. And all of us, every one of us, have that innately within us, and we can draw on it as an essential resource in our life. Yeah.
So 3 years ago, the reason we were first talking was your book had come out.
Yeah.
Anybody hasn't been able to read this, it's highly recommended. And I just like you to reflect. It's the 5 invitations, which were don't wait, welcome everything, push away nothing, bring your whole self to experience, find a place of rest in the middle of the things, and cultivate a don't know mind. So you went out touring around, talking about this book all over the place, and Kira has posted the website about your book and teaching. So, what would you like to impart of the experience of having this book out there and having people read it and out and teaching about it? Was this also a learning experience for you yourself?
Well, yes, of course, I learned, but what I realized in writing the book, of course, was that I'd had remarkable teachers in my life. I mean, we were just talking about Ram Dass. He was a dear friend also and teacher, but, the 1,000 or more people that I sat with bedside, they were the true teachers. They were the ones that really showed me what matters most, And one of the things, those invitations, if you will, they were guides that we used in caring for people near the end of life. But it turns out they also had a relevance for the rest of us in living a life of meaning and purpose and value, And the first one that you mentioned, I won't go through them all, but the first one you mentioned, don't wait. That's really important, I mean, to imagine that we're going to have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime on our deathbed is an absurd gamble. It's a ridiculous gamble. So don't wait. You know, the time to do that work is now. Yeah. You know, waiting is full of expectation, waiting for the next moment to arrive. We miss this one. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been with family members who've said, you know, when is mom going to die? And waiting for that moment of death, they miss all the moments in between. So don't wait as a kind of, you know, encouragement to step into our life fully, completely, not to miss a moment of it. It's not some kind of urgency like, you know, finish everything on your bucket list. It's not about that. It's about actually being present, not waiting to be present. To tell someone you love that you love them. You know, don't wait to do that. Yeah, the two most important questions that are on people's hearts and minds when they're dying aren't, you know, what are my great regrets? Or, you know, what happens after I die? Yeah, of course people ask those questions, but the two questions on their hearts and minds are, am I loved? Am I loved? And did I love well? Yeah. And if those are the two most important questions at the end of our life, well, aren't they the most important questions now? And please, let's not wait to answer them or to live into them. So for me, that's one of the most important lessons that my teachers, folks who are dying, taught me. And when I go out on the road, as you say, you know, talk about the book or teach, you know, people want to get down to the fun. They start with how-to questions. Give me the tools, give me the techniques, but they want to get down to the fundamentals. What really matters? What really matters? And, you know, it matters in the way we conduct our relationships. It matters in the way in which we deliver care. It matters as how we sustain ourselves as we deliver care for clinicians and caregivers. I mean, right now, the moral distress that is sweeping across healthcare is just, you know, it's epidemic. It's epidemic. You know, clinicians and caregivers being asked to do impossible things right now in the midst of the pandemic. Yeah. So the more I come close to the precariousness of life, the more precious life becomes, the more real it gets for me. And what I find is when people come to talks that I give or conversations like this one, is they want to talk about what's real. They want to talk about what matters. And that's what we're doing here today. Yeah.
So one of the last chapters in your book is about courage. And I reread it and it rang particularly important and true to me in the midst of, as you say, this pandemic. You know, this is where I work, and just on this morning's call, one of the health directors for the state for Los Angeles actually said, it's time to shut everything down. For the time being. I mean, it's looking very ominous at this point.
Yeah.
And I'd actually, I'm going to quote somebody I haven't quoted before on this. I was a geek when I was a kid and read Tolkien books over and over. And I think everybody knows about the Lord of the Rings, right? But there's a great passage in there where there's an impending war, struggle for the survival of real civilization. And Frodo, who is the young Hobbit who ends up saving the world, but he's not there yet. He says, I wish this need not have happened in my time. And Gandalf, the great wizard, who is the good wizard, says, so do I. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us, right? So great words from a wizard. in the midst of this pandemic, I'm wondering if this has brought some of these teachings more real to you as well, in terms of how do we cope with the bigger picture of vulnerability, for one thing, threats to ourselves and to those who love us, and threats to our way of life, really, too, because we have an economic collapse, in a sense. And we don't know. It's really, it's been called, even before now, the age of anxiety. And it's mostly, you could call that also the age of uncertainty. We really don't know what's going to happen. And we have glimmers of hope. I could say three things. One is there's what look to be some very effective vaccines coming. And the treatment of the severe forms of this disease is much better than it was just 6 months ago. Much more likely to not even have to go into a hospital, but if you do, come out. And then we've just recently had an election 1 month ago now that has given many people a sense of more hope than they had before. So I'm wondering, in terms of this great threat, this cloud, this pandemic, if that has brought some of these teaching more real to you, and what your thoughts might be about that.
Oh boy, Steve, there's a lot in that,
Yes.
but I want to just come back to this word that you use, courage. Courage. I mentioned in passing this idea of moral distress, the idea that, we know what's ethically right to do, but we can't always do it. We feel constrained, or not able to do what we feel or know is right, And one of the balancing factors for that is a kind of moral courage, the ability to stand up on our own behalf, or to stand up on behalf of the values and ethics that we value, And we've been challenged around those things in this country, certainly in the last 4 years. Courage is, there's different kinds of courage, right? Like the courage that we think of first is the courage of the warrior, right? The contemporary soldier, the first responder, the ER doc, the people that are doing amazing stuff, who are working in healthcare, facing unbelievable suffering with inadequate resources, for example. And that healthy warrior courage is motivated by honor and loyalty and service and commitment, right? And it has to be balanced with intelligence, yeah. But there's a shadow side of that courage too, which, can be aroused by shame and coercion and the need to control, or some kind of defensiveness that leads us to a kind of false invulnerability, yeah. So we need a different kind of courage too. We need courage of heart, right? Which is every bit as powerful. It's that we allow, there's a strength in it, but it's not necessarily the strength of, fighting off all of the difficulties of life. It's more a willingness to be undefended, to be open, a willingness to touch, as we mentioned earlier, the 10,000 joys and sorrows. That's courage of heart. We need it. And then there's this word that we keep coming around to, which is vulnerability. And I think there's a courage to be vulnerable. Yeah. And my experience in my own life and lives of others that I'm working with is that the courage to be vulnerability opens a doorway to a aspect of our being which is in fact invulnerable. It's not the teenage invulnerability or the invulnerability rather of stoicism. It's this deeper capacity that we have, a kind of spaciousness that can allow the winds of the world to blow right through us. Yeah. And they can do that because there's no place for the fear to stick. And we can cultivate that capacity. So there's these different kinds of courage, I think, And, in my tradition, we talk about bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are great beings, Buddhas or saints, sages, in a way. And they go towards suffering, and they have immensely compassionate hearts. And they're able to stay present for suffering that would bring the rest of us to our knees, in a way. But I think there's lots of bodhisattvas among us. I don't think they're so special. Like, I know this guy, Steve, you may know him. His name is Julio, and he works in a big, metropolitan hospital in San Francisco. I know him working there, and he's a kind of nurse's aide, attendant, and he goes. His job is to clean up the rooms, basically, after there's been a code. And you know what it's like in a code sometimes, and it's a mess in the room. And when a person dies, everybody leaves the room, and the drawers to all the supplies are open, and there's rags on the floor, and his job is to go in and clean up the space. And I think Julio has courage, because he goes into the room and he surveys the whole room, and he looks at the mess and the chaos that's there. And then he goes over to the patient, and he leans over and he whispers in their ears, the patient who's died. He says, "I want to let you know that you've died, but I'm here with you, and I'm going to do my best to wash away all dust and confusion." And then he goes about tidying up the whole room, putting everything away, creating a kind of clean and ordered space. And then he goes about bathing the person who's died. And some nursing supervisor sticks her head in the room and says, "Come on, hurry up, we need this room." But the other nurses know what Julio's doing, and they protect him. And they stick their heads in the door too, and they say, "It's okay, Julio, take your time. We got it." They value what he's doing. They know it's ethically right to do it. So I think there's manifestations of courage that are happening all over the place. And in this pandemic, we're seeing it, on steroids. The kinds of stuff that's happening in hospitals where clinicians are being both extraordinary clinicians, great expertise, and also family members to people. We keep saying people are dying alone in hospitals. They're not dying alone. They're dying oftentimes in the company of remarkable clinicians who are there not only with their expertise, but with their human hearts. And I'm really grateful to them. Really grateful to them. Yeah.
Yeah, in your book, after listing a number of instances of courage that you'd heard about or witnessed, you said, "When fear speaks, courage is the heart's answer." I thought was quite beautiful,
Yeah.
I wonder, I'm wondering if you have, just elaborating on this a little bit, if you have tips or advice for those living with this anxiety and uncertainty, beyond stepping in and working in that way, which some of us can do and some cannot, but just in terms of living through this, what do you find useful?
Well, we've already talked about don't wait, and we're waiting. A lot of us are waiting. When can we get back to normality? And we're waiting in this kind of bubble, this pause we're in, which is often characterized by a great deal of anxiety and fear. And so the more we're able to come into the present moment, to sense our bodies, to be with people who we care about in whatever way we can be with them, it grounds us, it stabilizes us, it gives us the capacity to take a slightly deeper breath, I think, and be more available to people. So, looking too far ahead sometimes we can get ourselves in a tangle, of worry and anxiety. Yesterday, I was talking to a group of clinicians in Italy, and I was talking about, might sound trite, but I was talking about a sense of wonder, being able to have a sense of wonder, that it seems like an indulgence right now or some distraction, but actually it's necessary. It's a resource for us. It's even a refuge for us to be able to evoke a sense of wonder about, what's happening and how we're meeting it, and to appreciate the smaller things in our life, and to walk through life with some ability to still experience awe and wonder. So anyway, perhaps I go off the subject, but I think these very human things that we know as human beings are helpful to us. And of course, we know the normal things like let's get enough sleep, and let's get a walk outside, and let's eat well. Those things that are essential, of course, to maintaining some balance. Steve, you and I came up on the AIDS epidemic together. And there's a lot of things that are happening now that remind me of those times, of course. But one of the things that I know you've been experiencing a lot is grief. And I did too in the AIDS epidemic. Sometimes I work with 30 or 40 people a week who died. Right now there are nurses in hospitals who are taking care of more people who die in a single day than are in their families. What do we do with that, I used to do three things. I would come to my meditation cushion, sit on my meditation cushion, and because it would help stabilize me, it would help regulate my emotional, upheaval. But that wasn't enough. So I used to go to a body worker, a friend of mine who was really good, and I'd walk in his office and he'd say, "Where today, Frank?" And I'd say, "Just here and on my shoulder." And he'd put his hand on my shoulder and he wouldn't do anything else. He'd just keep his hand there for an hour, and I would weep for an hour. And there was something about that physical touch and also the relational quality of his contact with me that was really important, that enabled me to experience the grief that I was unable to go near. And then I did a third thing. I went to San Francisco General, where I knew the nurses, some of them there. And I went up to the maternity ward. And there I went to see hold babies that were born to addicted mothers who were addicted to crack or alcohol. And these little infants would just shake in my arms, and I would sit and rock them and stroke their throats and bellies, and eventually I could soothe them. And that was actually really helpful to me because there was other suffering that I couldn't relieve when I went back to work with folks who were dying of AIDS. So there was something about that service and that ability to know that some suffering can be relieved while others can't, that was really helpful to me. So those were things that I did to work with the grief and the impossibility that we were facing at the time, which is reminiscent of what we're experiencing now is reminiscent of those times. Yeah.
Very much so. We did a talk for the new school just a couple months ago with Dr. Donald Abrams, who was one of the pioneers at San Francisco General. It's posted on our site. I highly recommended people to watch this. He did say that it took him years to realize that after that initial experience, so many patients dying, that he had PTSD. He had clinical distress that he had buried, and it took a long time to work through that.
Yeah.
From that experience, which was formative,
Right now, caregivers who are just exposed to the suffering, the daily exposure to the suffering, enormous suffering, is hard because they don't always have the tools or the wherewithal to integrate that suffering. They just go back into it the next day. And then that's complicated by what we mentioned again, moral distress. What's ethically right to do, but you can't do it. You're constrained from doing it. And that develops, moral residue in a way, a kind of buildup of this distress that's there. That's different than just emotional distress, And it can crescendo. There can be this effect that occurs where people who have this ongoing moral distress and have this kind of residue, it just becomes too much. And what happens is they become insensitive to moral concerns, actually. And it dramatically impacts their ability to be effective caregivers. And it spills out on the people that they serve, the patients and families that they serve. And so unless we can help those caregivers work with that moral distress, we're going to see more and more withdrawing. We're going to see more people leaving the profession. We're going to see inadequate care in the systems in which we're now caring for people. What I want to emphasize is that isn't just the job of the nurse or the clinician. Moral distress is a signal that the systems are not able to deal or aren't willing to deal with the distress that's occurring for the people who work in those systems. So it's not just, let's teach a little mindfulness to the nurses. The system has to figure out a way to deal with these kind of, this ethical, moral distress that people are experiencing. I work with a group of, talked with a group of docs and nurses who are ER docs in New York at the height of the outbreaks there, the surge there. And, they were having to put people on ventilators without any informed consent. And it was really hard for them, really hard for them. So, yeah, we are facing really big challenges here, and there's no simple answers for it. There's no simple tips. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so we actually have an anonymous question here, which is it's sort of what we've just been talking about, but it's a why question. Why is it that some experiences of suffering harden and close people off, while other experiences of suffering soften and open them up?
Yeah, well, it's hard to answer these questions in, just conceptually, but I think some of it has to do with where we have resonance with that suffering. Jung talked about the wounded healer, right? The one who dives deep into his or her own wounds and comes back with some kind of jewel, if you will, some kind of gift that gives them a capacity to have resonance with someone else who has a similar wound. Yeah. Now, if we don't do that dive, if we don't understand or work with our own suffering, then we become wounding healers. We become people who pass on our trauma to other people, who add more fear to situations when what's needed is no fear. So it has to do with it has to do with have we done our homework? Yeah, have we looked and seen what our own relationship is to the particular kind of suffering that we're facing? And some are more difficult for us than others, So when I'm working with someone who's dying, I'm always doing my homework. I'm always looking at my own fear, my own grief, my own, desire to run out of the room. Yeah.
I'm wondering, three years ago, we talked a little bit about kind of the culture of denial of death and all of that. And you were actually optimistic in a sense that you felt like more people were, actually exploring this and moving past denial in our culture. I'm wondering which, in 3 years since then, if you felt that more and if you think this pandemic is going to push that along further, or, is there some improvement there, or at least change, from our tradition of not wanting to face it at all?
Yes, I remain hopeful, optimistic. I think that really, as a culture, the subject has come out of the closet, so to speak. Death has come out of the closet. And we're more willing to talk about it, certainly in these days. And also, a generation is emerging, a generation of, baby boomers who are emerging, who are sandwiched between their aging adult parents and their young kids, still. And that generation wants choice, we have 10 different ways we like our coffee when we go to Starbucks. We want choice in the way in which we die. And so we're getting more involved, and there's more conversations, and family members are with people who are dying. Not right now in the pandemic, but up until this point they have been, and so that's giving us more familiarity with the process, and familiarity, helps to reduce fear, and when there's a reduction in fear, we have more choice. When there's a reduction in fear, there's more love available also, I think. So yeah, I'm hopeful about it. I think that look at what we're doing right here, on a whatever day of the week this is. My brain can't tell me what day of the week this is, but here we are, hundreds of us on this call, wanting to come face to face with something that most people want to run away from still. And last thing I'll say on this is that denial gets a bad rap. I mean, denial just means I'm not ready to do that yet. And I think you don't take away someone's denial until you got something better to replace it with. Yeah. So, yeah. Let's understand that denial is a pretty good coping strategy for a lot of people for a period of time until they can develop other coping strategies. Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, and we talked last time, we have a very strong instinct preference for living.
Yeah.
It's built into us. But you just mentioned again, we like a lot of choices in our coffee, et cetera. So that I always bring this up because I'm just wondering what your take on it is. Choice in dying is a big issue. It's spreading around the nation even more since we talked last time, to give people an option of assisted dying. And, it seems to be working on a societal sense in terms of the big downsides of a slippery slope of people being forced to die are not coming true. But I'm wondering if you have more thoughts on how this is going and, what the lessons might be there.
Well, this territory well, Stephen. Of course, there are several states and District of Washington that now where this is the physician-assisted death is a protocol that's allowed. And I think it's been really helpful actually in our country. Because one, it had a kind of shock jock effect in that it started getting a lot of people talking about death and also about good pain control and good symptom management. So particularly in the states where physician-assisted death is allowed, hospice referrals are up and pain management is better and, symptom control is often better. So I think that that's been invaluable. Sometimes when people feel they have a choice, their anxiety goes down, if you look at the state of Oregon, and you look at the numbers there, thousands of people write for information about physician-assisted death, 1,000 or so start to seek out the services. But actually, very, very few people actually go through the process. The numbers are really quite low. And I think that what that means is that people really want to have they want to have some agency in their life. Yeah. And once they have the agency, they don't necessarily need to go through the process of physician-assisted death. Sometimes just the agency is enough, But I don't have a moral judgment about how people should die. I think dying is hard enough without us having to bear the burden of everybody's ideas about how we should do it. So I think it's been a valuable and useful addition to the continuum of care when one has a life-threatening illness. Yeah. Really, just to distinguish, the last thing is just to distinguish that from suicide, which is a really different experience. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. One of the conundrums there, though, is that with all the laws and guidelines as they've been passed, is that you have to be able to do it yourself. You have to be cogent at the time. And so people who might, one of our greatest fears for many people is to become too demented or too physically disabled to take things in your own hand, or, and so forth. Actually did a talk at a hospital just last year about this, and asked, about dementia in the context of choice and dying. And it was of course, a biased audience, because they were all there and worked with these things, clinicians and so forth. But I polled the large crowd. Do you think there should be an option for people to request this ahead of time? Should I become this demented? Could I be put out of this? And had 100% yes in that crowd. But the dangers that's the slippery slope that people worry about. But I'm just in a way, I'm leading into another question here from a Nancy Ryan quote. My best friend has Parkinson's disease and has been declining for several years. He does not have any money. I help him as much as I can. He has no family willing to help him. I carry fear that as his illness progresses, I'm sorry, the question has just moved on here. But how do I live with this, and how do I help to take care of him without hope that things will get better?
Yeah. Oh boy, these are kind of impossible questions, Steve, because we're trying to deal with these things on an individual basis. Like maybe Nancy's trying to deal with this man that she knows, and it's quite an isolating experience for her. I mean, we keep talking about healthcare reform in this country, but if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that our public health care systems are in need of an infusion of capital, but also, some rethinking. If ever we've understood that everybody needs access to healthcare, the pandemic has certainly shown us that it is right. And if people have access, then it doesn't fall solely on the shoulders of an individual caregiver, whether it's a family member or a friend like Nancy. That's the first thing that we have to acknowledge. And the second is that we need to do a lot more education of people, not only around access to healthcare, but helping them to really see what are their choices and what really thinking through in advance what they want. I know I rewrote my advanced care directives at the beginning of the pandemic. You and I spoke about them. So that's also an important thing to consider. And lastly, I'd be concerned about the slippery slope there, but I think we trust caregivers to make family members and other duly appointed people to make other decisions for us. When people are not able to make them for themselves, why can't we trust them to make this decision too? Yeah. Our advanced care directives give power to other individuals to make life and death decisions for us. Why is this not one of the ones that could be included in that list? Yeah. I think we need a lot more conversation. We need a lot more discussion about this. And we don't just need it within the healthcare systems. We need it within families. Yeah. So, the Conversation Project is one of the best sources for how to have that kind of conversation. And I'd certainly refer people to there. Yeah. Okay. Can we, I don't know what our time is, Steve, because my brain doesn't track time, but I'd love to hear from some of the people who are on this call. Either send us a chat or, if you like, you can go to, can they raise their hand? Is that a possibility?
Well, we've got the Q&A here is where I'm reading these from already.
Oh,
here.
okay. All right. So
there are some.
So put your question in Q&A. Let's go to some of those so we can try and respond.
Yeah, that's where the other ones have come from. And here's another one that's flows from what we've been talking about from a BJ Gallagher. I took care of my mother for the last 5 years of her life. She had Alzheimer's, and that experience of caregiving, I found a depth and quality of love for her that I'd never had before. It felt like that love blew my heart wide open. And as a result, I feel everything so acutely. I cry often. Seems like everything touches my heart and brings me to tears. I'm fine with feeling all this stuff, but it's exhausting. It just wears me out. I don't know what to do with my exhaustion. So there's vulnerability for you.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You know, BJ, I know BJ, so I can speak to this a little bit. You know, sometimes our exhaustion is about doing too much. We have too many activities and we don't resource ourselves adequately. And sometimes it's about doing things with an absence of wholeheartedness, you know, and that includes caring for ourselves with wholeheartedness, I would say. You know, when we've experienced something like what BJ is describing, you know, it takes its toll on us, and there's a period of recovery that we need where we have to resource ourselves. You know, it's like when I'm working with clinicians, I say to them, you know, you guys are not normal. You know, it's not normal to, you know, be with dying people on a daily basis. You know, that's not a normal activity that happens in our society. So the normal coping strategies that you have to go home and watch TV and have a glass of wine aren't going to be sufficient to enable you to metabolize or integrate what you've been bearing witness to. So people need other skill sets. You know, they need ways of regulating their bodies, hearts, and minds. Meditation, of course, is one. Time in nature is another. You know, we know the list of things that we can do. The challenge is to do them, you know, and to do them with some regularity. But I also, the last thing I want to say is that we can't put all the weight on the individual caregiver. That's not fair. You know, we need to create systems that help people to resource, that help people to have the kind of ongoing support they need when they're going through a process of grieving or the kind of exhaustion that BJ is speaking about. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things, last thing, sorry. One of the things that happens when I'm talking to clinicians is I ask them, what's good about being exhausted? And they give me interesting answers. They say, well, other people think I'm really dedicated. They think I'm really committed to my work, or it shows that I really care, you know. And these are misunderstandings, I think, you know. I think these are misunderstandings that drive us into actions that are not so helpful for us. I don't think that's specifically what BJ is talking about. I think BJ is just speaking about the utter tiredness that comes from unintegrated emotional material. Yeah. So, you know, I do two things.
Related.
Go ahead.
No, it's just a related question that flows from that again. From Laura Ann Moore. I'm a massage therapist, and I'm beginning to share with my clients how our emotions affect our bodies and the need to deal with these trapped emotions. Any suggestions on how to introduce this?
Oh, that's really good that you're doing that. Tell me her name again, Steve, the person's name again?
Laura.
Laura.
Laura Ann.
Okay, Laura Ann, you know, before there's any emotion, before there is any thought in our minds or hearts, there's some kind of sensual contact. One of the senses is firing, right? We see something, we hear something, we taste something, smell something, we touch something. So that's, you know, that's the first experience, is the experience of the body. And the more contact we have with our body, the more access we have to our emotional life and to our mental states. Yeah. And the more choice we begin to have about how to regulate around those states, how to manage those emotional and mental states skillfully in some way. So helping people to have more contact with their body is useful. The challenge is that they need some companionship, at least initially, when that physical contact evokes some strong emotions in them. Yeah. And so then that's when your good, skillful hands can be invaluable. But it isn't about, you know, it's about just keeping your hands on them. When I was teaching our volunteers how to turn somebody in bed, in the hospice, we'd often do it with two people. And one person was the safe person. They just kept their hands on the individual. So when that experience of being turned, which is frightening to a patient, occurs, one's doing the turning, the other's the safe person. And you know that from your massage work. This often in massage, we talk about the safe hand and the other hand that's doing the work, right? So you need to be a safe hand with them as well when you're introducing them to this work, to this possibility, rather. Okay. Let's go to someone else, Steve.
Well, a very fundamental, basic one. I'm trying to pull up here. Well, basically, pancreatic cancer is a very tough one to deal with. Usually means the end is near.
Yeah.
What can we say to them about dying?
Oh,
patient with pancreatic cancer.
So this is the challenge with questions in a chat or a Q&A, because they can be, they can get conceptual, and we can't answer these questions cognitively. If I were talking to this person, I'd ask them more questions. I'd inquire with them about what their basic concerns are. I'd want to look at the color in their cheeks and whether or not their lower chin was shaking as they were speaking to me about this. Because sometimes we ask a question looking for information, but the information really doesn't satisfy what's actually happening in our hearts and minds, which may be that we're just frightened, that someone we love is dying and we don't know how to deal with it. And so we want more information so we can tell them. So I want to make a quick distinction here, and this may go off subject from this person's question, but compassion is that capacity that is innate to us that's other-focused. It rises up as an action to relieve someone else's suffering. And it often is motivated by empathy, the empathetic concern, right? That we feel something about the other person's hurt and pain. So compassion then tries to do something or tries to be with the person in a way that reduces their suffering, as we were just talking to Laura about. But there's another motivation that occurs, and it's personal distress. I see someone else that's hurting and in pain, and it's really freaking me out. It's causing me an enormous amount of distress. And so I do something to the other person to relieve my distress. And that's self-focused. That's not compassion, it's self-focused. So in those moments, we have to do things to address our own personal distress instead of doing something to the other, even sometimes giving them more information. So I want to just add that as a preliminary. Then coming back to this question, instead of giving the person more information about their dying, you have to find out how they see their dying. You have to inquire with them. You have to be willing to hang out with them and see, what's there. Do they have frightening stories about what happens after they die? Are they scared of pain? And then you can compassionately intervene and address those particular concerns for them, as opposed to doing something sort of broadly and generally. There's a story in the book, Steve, you may remember it, of a woman I knew, Christian scientist, very just had tremendous faith, And her granddaughter came to see her, and she said, "Grandma, when you're dying, you don't have to worry, because when you die, everybody who's died before you will be there to meet you." Now, Grandma had been okay with her dying, but now she was terrified. And she got scared because her husband, Edgar, who died 5 years before her, had been beating her. And the idea of spending eternity with her was terribly frightening to Grandma. So I'm saying this because I don't want to impose my ideas on anyone. I want to inquire with them, find out from them what it is that's concerning them and what resources they might have available to address that, and then to support that in them. I think it's really important that we support individuals, capacity to be part of their own healing, their own autonomy. Yeah.
I remember a resident at the Zen Hospice long ago who said something similar. He said, I hope you're not going to tell me that I'm going to see everybody I know after I leave here, because there's a lot of people I do not want to see again. Yeah. This was a guy who had lived in the street and had a rough street life for a long time. So, we had an interesting question back to the choice and dying issue. How do you explain the difference between assisted dying and suicide to a patient who's considering assisted dying and does not want to be, guilty of suicide?
Well, it's hard because we have so many moral judgments about how people should die, and we have lots of moral judgments about suicide. We don't see it. Our compassionate hearts don't always open to people in suicide. We shame them more than we open our hearts to them frequently. Suicide is often an action of fear, or just distress. Like, it's the best strategy I can come up with at the moment, driven by unimaginable pain. And I don't just mean physical pain, but mental and emotional suffering as well. I was working with a Buddhist teacher, actually, and he was coming to the end of his life as a result of a long-term illness, and he was wanting to choose the option of physician-assisted death, but he was very guilty that he would be doing his death wrong, in a way, and that this would be sending the wrong message to his students. And we talked, about it in a very honest way. And I said, well, first of all, we're all going to die. There's just different ways that we die, so let's not put a lot of judgments on the particular, what gives rise to our death. But then we really just sat down, we talked honestly, and I said, well, what do you want, And, he began to tell me that what he wanted was to feel loved, regardless of his choices. He wanted to be told that he wanted to be respected, regardless of his choices, And so we came up with a kind of message from him about this. And we actually printed up that message and gave it out to all his students and his family. And instead of everybody coming into the room with judgment, they came in the room with great tenderness and compassion, and surrounded him with support for his decision. So I think when we take our personal preference and personal judgments and biases out of the situation, it can help enormously. Yeah.
We have, flowing right from that, we have a lovely question from somebody who looks to be maybe new to this work. Anthea is her name. As a new death doula, hospice volunteer, and caregiver, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you do your homework with patients so as not to bring your own stuff, fears, etc., into caring for them. Thank you, Anthea. So, Frank, do you have any stuff?
Oh, man, do I have stuff. I got all kinds of stuff. And some of it's, I worked with, and some of it's quite unresolved. But here's the thing about my stuff and about your stuff, Thea, is it's all a meeting place, I mean, if we think we got to have it all worked out and be perfect before we do this work, well, nobody's going to be doing the work, So my stuff, my grief, is a meeting place with other people's grief. My anger is a possible meeting place with other people's anger. Yeah, those are things we can connect around. We can make contact around. I don't have to have all the answers, but I have to be willing to hang out with both my own experience and theirs. We imagine it's our expertise that will serve, but again, I think it's our humanity that serves the most. Now, you can't use the patient as your therapist, particularly not if you're a doula, But, away from that bed, if something comes up at the bedside, then you got to come home and do that work, You got to take a look and see what's my own relationship to sickness, to old age, to death, to suffering. Yeah. And so you're not projecting it unconsciously onto the person that you're working with. Yeah. So yeah, be willing to look.
I think this is related to a question from Rebecca is, how do we best work towards healing from experiencing ongoing grief? I mean, that's some of the stuff, really, is grief itself is universal as you live on. And it's something we have to learn to live with, and how best to do that.
Well, I feel like the answer man here. I have to be careful. I don't have all the answers to these things. I often have to feel my way, and I often say my method is the Braille method. I feel my way along into the experience, and I let the experience and the exchange with another person show me and reveal to me, if you will, what actually will help here. Yeah. But what I can say is that if we stop thinking of grief as a pathology, that helps enormously. If we stop thinking of grief as something that we should get over, get behind us, that helps enormously. I mean, it's curious to me. I often say, we often talk about getting over our grief, but we never talk about getting over our joy or getting over our happiness. Like, grief is part of the human experience. It's our common ground with each other. And I'm not sure that we get over it. I think that we learn to live with it skillfully. I think that we learn to live with it in a way where it doesn't have us by the throat all the time. But we need to recognize that grief is a long, slow process of the soul. And it can't be rushed. And it can't be subjected to models of, what stages we are at and when, and why shouldn't, if we're at stage 2, why aren't we at stage 5, So there are different phases that occur in grief, and they're not linear. They explode onto our awareness suddenly sometimes. When someone we love dies, even if we've been prepared for it for months on end, we're still shocked. Often we're shocked, and we feel like we've been punched in the belly and we can't find our breath. And it feels like that, and that's a face of grief, Grief's not just about sadness, it's about fear and anger and numbness, where we feel like we're walking through molasses sometimes. And then there's this experience of constant losing that occurs. When someone you love dies, you don't just lose them once, you lose them multiple times. If your wife dies and you get into bed at night and the sheets are cold, you lose her again. Or if your husband was the one who did the banking business, when you have to go down to the bank and figure out your way into the, safe deposit box, you lose him again. And so there's this ongoing experience when there's been a significant loss in our life. There's an ongoing experience of losing that continues. Gradually, with attention, we have this phrase that time heals. That's crap. Excuse me, but it's crap. Time alone does not heal anything. Time and attention, time and wisdom, time and compassion heal. Yeah. So we have to bring our attention to what's occurring over time. And one of the things that occurs over time is that the knot of grief, through our loving attention, begins to get untied. It gets loosened, and it doesn't have us by the throat so much anymore. And we begin to develop a kind of internal relationship with the person who's died. And then we bring them with us everywhere. And the sense of distance from them shifts and changes in our life. And they get included, they get integrated into our life. And then we can reinvest in other dimensions of our life that we had to withdraw from to include the many faces of grief that are natural and normal to the experience of loss. Yeah. So it's not a pathology. you don't get over the grief. You include the grief. It becomes, a richer, essential element of your human existence. Yeah.
I learned through experience and have tried to impart when I teach. The original book that we all learned from in the teaching was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and her 5 stages of grief became iconic. And so many people saw those as something that you moved through and then you were done. And the way I see it is those are stages that you can go through every day or every hour or every minute. And the thing is that they become less acute and less troublesome as you go through them over time.
Yeah.
But they're still with you. Yeah. So you can experience the first, shock, over and over and, months or years later, but it might impact you less painfully. And that, eventually you'll arrive at a better place, but it's not completely linear.
No, it's by no means a linear process. And Elizabeth didn't mean them that way. I think that they've been distorted, and our fascination with models, causes us to adapt them in a way that, makes them into a linear process. And by the way, those same 5 stages got transferred onto how people die. And everyone imagined, hospice workers around the country thought that their job was to get people to acceptance. That was the final box to check, But I don't think it's true. I don't think acceptance is the end of the road. I think it's the beginning, actually. When my marriage falls apart, I might accept it, but it doesn't mean I'm happy about it. Yeah. So, in the dying process that I've witnessed anyway, sometimes people come to acceptance, but often after acceptance comes a deeper experience, which is chaos. A kind of chaos when the sense of self, the known self, the familiar self, the egoic self, the small separate self we've taken ourselves to be, when that's breaking down, when all the ways we've defined ourselves or identified, when those things are changing, when they're either being stripped away by illness or gracefully given up, there's a kind of chaos that occurs. And in that chaos, an appreciably deeper dimension than acceptance emerges, and it's surrender. And surrender is not weakness. Surrender is ceasing the struggle. And that's engendered by faith sometimes, or relationships that we can really rely on, but also by exhaustion. I come back to that earlier question about exhaustion. Sometimes we just can't keep up the fight anymore. And so we surrender. And we soften and we relax. And we realize that the thing that was most frightening to us, that big expanse out there, is actually our own nature. And we often, or I've seen frequently, people slip very gracefully into that experience of surrender, which is the doorway to transformation.
So we are actually up on our end of time here. I'm wondering if you want to say anything in closing. I'm just going to, at the end of your book, you printed a few great poems, haikus, etc., and one that I particularly love that I hadn't seen before, from somebody named Kozan Ichikyo.
Yeah.
Died in 1360, so almost 700 years ago. Empty-handed I entered the world, barefoot I leave it, my coming, my going, 2 simple happenings that got entangled. I love that.
Yeah.
So, do you want to say anything in parting here?
No, well, just that, there's that tradition in Zen practice, both from monks and lay people, to write a death poem on the day of your death that tells the essential truth of your life. That's what Kozan's poem was about, And, but we don't have to be Zen masters, and we don't have to wait until the time of our dying to write the poem that or to come into contact with what means the most to us, what matters the most to us, what's essentially true for us. And I think when we do that, we can have a kind of confidence in our life, you know? So the only thing I want to say in the end here, and maybe I've talked too much about love, I don't know, but it's partly because it's my biggest support right now, is that you, each of you, everybody on this call, you can trust your essential heart to be a reliable guide. It's not going to abandon you. It's important that we develop expertise and skills, of course, but trust your heart to be a reliable guide. And here I'm not speaking about your emotional heart. I'm talking about your wise heart. Yeah? That's not going to abandon you. And it's going to give you the guidance you need to move through situations that you've never been through before. Don't think about dying or grieving as a binary process. It's a process of paradox, you know, and the more skilled we become at embracing that paradox, you know, Jung talked about holding the tension of opposites, right? When we can hold, not so busy choosing between this and that, between either or. Often what emerges is a new possibility that we couldn't have imagined. So be willing to embrace paradox. The dying process and the grieving process are chock full of paradox, yeah? And they're not, they're better addressed by both and thinking than binary thinking, okay? So be kind to yourself if you're in the middle of one of these processes. Be very kind to yourself. Nothing's more important. And Steve, I want to thank you for everything you do and for being such a mentor to me around public health and these issues. You've been really a great support for me in my learning. And thanks to everybody at Commonweal and all the people behind the scenes who make this possible and the new school. So, yeah, I hope that somehow my words have been of some small support to some people here. And if so, I'm glad to have contributed my time. Yeah.
I'm very confident that they have. So, Frank, thank you very much. And thank you for everybody who's joined us. We, as you know, I believe we do these free of charge. We ask for donations if anybody's willing. You can find the link, and Kira has posted it in the chat box, and I think in the Q&A perhaps too. It's also on our website, the New School at Commonweal. Special deal is we have these beautiful mugs now that we are offering. $20 donation. You can get this sent to you. Frank will get one if you don't have it yet. I use it for everything, tea, cereal. My late great dog Shuggy even enjoyed it very much for anything that I could put in it. So again, and thank you, Frank. Thank you for everybody joining here. Thank you all for joining us at the New School in Commonweal. We will sign off here.